if I think of the effectiveness in sharing the gospel, I have to look first of all at the scriptures, because that's our primary model. And it seems to me that in the New Testament, the main ways in which the gospel spread are firstly verbally at three levels, through people, some Greek scholars would say they gossiped the gospel. Others met from house to house in small groups, and then others were involved in proclaiming the gospel publicly. Wherever the church grows exponentially, it seems to me you have to have those three things in evidence. In some countries where there's overt persecution, it's much more difficult to preach. But it's very rare to see any revivals in the history of the church without those three things being present. So I would say we have to emphasize all three at the same time, and that's certainly what we see in the student world in the European context. The other thing about the New Testament is that it demonstrates the importance of attractive Christian communities. And so it's not just a case of the verbal proclamation or communication of the gospel. People want to feel a sense of belonging. They want to feel part of a loving community. Where the Christian church did that in the New Testament, it was irresistibly attractive. And alongside that in the New Testament, they sought to dialogue with people in the public sphere. Mars Hill would be an example, defending and articulating the superiority of the truth claims of the gospel and the biblical worldview. I think we have to return to all of those things. Let me give an example of the issue of community and lifestyle. A few years ago, I visited the student movement in Portugal, and students there introduced me in the conference at Easter time to a group of 5 or 6 Chinese students. They'd arrived in the country 8 months before, and they wanted me to give these Chinese students a New Testament each, because they agreed to read it. So when I give the New Testaments to these Chinese students, I ask them, you've been in Portugal for 8 months now, it's the first time you're reading the New Testament. What do you think the Christian faith is about, and why do you want to read it, just based on what you've seen in the lives of the Christians? And they said, we've discovered 4 things about the Christian faith just from observing these Portuguese Christians. Firstly, they believe the Bible is God's voice to us, that God speaks through the Bible. We want to see if that's true. Secondly, they believe that Jesus is God incarnate. We want to look at the evidence in the New Testament to see if that backs up their claim. Thirdly, they're ordinary people just like us. Fourthly, they've loved us more than anybody else we've met since we come to Portugal, so we want to know why. Is it because of this message? That's why, ultimately, we want to read the New Testament. So there you have an example of lifestyle and personal gossiping of the gospel brought together in a secularized Western context to connect with Chinese students coming to study here. And I think that's very attractive. When I talk to students these days, and many people, they say, well, the day of proclamation is over. Nobody listens if you proclaim in public. It doesn't work, they say. They try it once or twice. My argument is that because it's a biblical approach, it's transcultural and transhistorical. And the key is not just to do it, but to do it together with all the other approaches and to persevere in doing it, because over time the gospel has its impact. There's something sharp and heraldic about a public articulation and defense of the gospel, which is very important. So that's derived from the biblical argumentation. Second line of approach is to look at church history. This evening I'm going to be speaking about mission in the modern world, and I want to introduce the students to the writings of an American missiologist called Kenneth Scott Latourette, who is professor of divinity and church history in Yale University some years ago. He wrote a series of books, 6 volumes of the history of the Christian church and 6 volumes of the history of Christian mission. In one of them he argued that there were 6 weapons in the Christian armory in terms of bearing witness before the watching world, and they were prayer, evangelism, lifestyle, action, argument, and suffering. Intriguingly, suffering. What he implied there and taught from looking at church history is that paradoxically, of course, no one likes to suffer or looks forward to it, but often when the watching world sees how Christians respond to suffering or adversity, and that we have hope in the midst of it, that is very attractive to the watching world. Permit me to give a personal example, which I may share tonight or tomorrow. 30 years ago, my only daughter died. I was the first Christian in my family. I'd been a Christian for 20 years at the time. The day after she died, my father asked to see me. He was a businessman. He said, "Your mother and I have arranged to be baptized in a month's time. We'd like you to speak at the service." I said, "Dad, you've got to become a Christian before you were baptized." He said, "I know that. I'm ready." And I said, "Well, why are you telling me today?" He said, "I've met a lot of people who said they were Christians over the last 20 years in business, and most of them were fakes." But he said, "You can't fake hope in the midst of adversity, son. You can fake other things, but you can't fake that." And then I said, "Well, why is it taking you so long? I've been a Christian for 20 years. He said, "Didn't you know? I've been watching you every day." And most unbelievers in the Western world are watching to see if our living testimony authenticates our words about Jesus Christ. Sometimes that takes a lifetime to be fleshed out, but there's no easy way around living a distinctive lifestyle and verbally testifying to Christ. Let me give one illustration from outside Europe. There was a missionary who worked in the South Pacific on one of the islands for 30 years. He didn't see anyone become a Christian in 30 years. After he died, leaving nothing apparently behind him, a young missionary went to take his place. Within 2 years, revival broke out on the island. Thousands of people became Christians and were baptized as a confession of faith. The young missionary knew it wasn't due to him because he could barely speak the language. So he said to the tribal chiefs, "You had this wonderful, godly Christian missionary for 30 years. None of you responded to his message about Jesus Christ in that time. Since I've been here, revival has broken out. What's the difference?" They said nothing. It was just that when that older missionary was here, he often told us that Christians don't need to fear dying because of the hope of heaven. So we waited to see if it was true. And when we saw that it was true, we decided to follow his example after he had died. So the world is watching to see whether our testimony authenticates what we have to say verbally.